All right, and I will make you host so you can screen share.
Okay.
Should be all yours.
Okay.
Stephen, can you confirm that's all good?
Okay, yeah. Can everyone see?
Yes, that's great. Thank you. All good. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, so thank you very much, Colin, for the introduction. And before I start, I want to give special thanks to my former colleague, Chris Bowden, who is the Vulture Program Manager at the RSPB and the co-chair of IUCN's Vulture Specialist Group. He kindly shared a recent Vulture talk with me, and I've kind of adapted it for tonight's audience. But yeah, great thanks to Chris. So Vultures. So as Colin said, I'm from Wellington, from New Zealand. Went over to Europe for a bit of an OE in 2004 and ended up working at the RSPB in 2006. And I didn't know anything about vultures at that stage. I'd never seen one. And I was quite interested to hear that the RSPB, a UK conservation organisation, had this big program of work in Asia saving vultures. The RSPB, for those who don't know it, is the UK partner in BirdLife International. So it's kind of like the equivalent of Forest and Bird in the UK, but kind of quite a lot bigger. So it's got about 1.3 million members, 170 nature reserves spread around the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, and it employs about 3,000 people. So kind of the size of DOC, but it's a conservation charity, not a government organisation. Time went on at the RSPB. It was a lovely place to work. And in 2015, I ended up as head of the International Species Recovery Team. And that's when my love affair with the vulture really began. And I was really interested to find out there are 23 species. But at this time in 2022, they're not doing all the best. There are 9 that are considered to be critically endangered by the IUCN and a further 3 that are endangered. And when I was working on this program, the focus of our work was in South Asia. So in UK terms, that's India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. And the vultures that we were mainly working on, I wish I could make that go away from the top. How can I do that? I don't seem to be able to. Anyway, other ones that you can see at the top with the heads obscured, unfortunately. There we go. So the white-rumped, slender-billed, and the Indian vulture were the ones we were mainly working on in India, and then worked a little bit on the red-headed vulture in Nepal as well, and the other species were present but weren't so much the focus of the program. And why were we interested? Well, if you ever visited Asia in the 1980s, this was the abundance of vultures. So this was a photo taken in New Delhi in 1984. Vultures were considered at that stage, the white-backed vulture, the white-rumped, was considered to be the world's most abundant bird of prey. There were estimated to be 40 million of them throughout Asia. At that time, there was no system for disposing of carcasses, cattle carcasses in India, and there were estimated to be hundreds of millions of cattle. So the vultures were really doing an important job cleaning everything up and keeping things semi-sanitary. They were not of conservation concern at all. There were so many of them, a bit like the passenger pigeon. No one imagined that anything could possibly go wrong. These were very, very common birds. No one was really worried about them. But as we know in conservation, usually it's just when you think things are perfect that they crash. And the avian influenza that was mentioned by Ian earlier is a terrible example of that happening recently. Vultures have a huge cultural significance in Asia. There's a demigod, Jatayu, in Hindu religion, who's a vulture, or maybe an eagle, but he's important. And the Parsis in particular relied on vultures to carry out sky, or to assist with sky burials. And the picture at the top right is the Tower of Silence. These were built in Mumbai in the 1930s, and the Parsis used them as part of their rituals around funereal rites. And they would carry the bodies out onto the shelf, and then the vultures would dispose of the flesh, and the bones were cleaned and then taken away. Vultures were also a common bird out in the rural landscape of Asia. They consumed carcasses, they kept things clean, and they also kept other scavenging animals, populations low because they were cleaning up the carcasses on the ground. Without vultures, feral dogs and jackals became much more common with some associated impacts. So what happened? In the mid-1990s, people started to see vultures dying, and they were turning up moribund with this head drooping, really, really unwell, or just dead. And no one really knew what was going on. They'd never been seen before, but huge numbers of vultures were ill or going missing. Researchers who were studying vultures, and there weren't that many because they were so common, and this is the affliction of the common bird in this country as well as anywhere else. They're not studied as much as the rare. Researchers who were studying them, including Vibhu Prakash from the Bombay Natural History Society in India, did start to notice declines. And the first really substantial declines were noticed at Keoladio National Park in Rajasthan, where Vibhu was studying a white-backed vulture colony, and he observed a decline of 97% between 1985 and 97. By 2003, that colony was gone. And that's a colony in a national park, so you would have thought it would be fairly safe. The same organisation, BNHS, carried out road transit surveys, and in 2000 they repeated a series of surveys that had been carried out in 1990, and those showed declines of 90% in vultures across northern India. So those are done by just driving in a vehicle with observers slowly along the road and counting all the soaring birds that are seen, and those can be repeated fairly accurately. In 2007, when that survey was repeated again, it showed a decline of 99.9% of vultures in 15 years in northern India. And similar declines were shown to have occurred in Nepal and Pakistan. So people talk about unprecedented declines, and these are just off the charts. You really can't believe that a bird's gone from being so abundant to being rare just so quickly. And of course, this captivated the research community, and people really did start to look for what the problem was. And looking at a bird like this, there were lots of theories about illness, disease, and environmental toxins, because we couldn't understand what was killing so many birds at once across such a big area. Like, how could it be happening? And finally, researchers in Pakistan from the Peregrine Fund and the Ornithological Society of Pakistan recognised that there could be a link to non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which I'm now going to refer to as NSAIDs, because non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs takes a long time to say. So they actually got records from captive holders of raptors and vultures across the world, and they found some records of captive birds that have been treated with NSAIDs suffering from visceral gout, which is what autopsies had shown a lot of these birds that were found in India to be suffering from. And having that connection, they were able to carry out tests in Pakistan with NSAIDs, and they found that they did have those effects on vultures that received them. And that was done in partnership actually with a South African conservation group who had what were then least concerned closely related vultures in rehab situations where they weren't able to be released, and they were sadly sacrificed for the good of their Asian compatriots. But doing those tests was the way that we could prove there was actually a link between the NSAIDs and the dead vultures. That was the only way to do it. So we're very, very grateful to those South African birds and researchers. This research on diclofenac so the drug that was responsible was diclofenac, commonly prescribed anti-inflammatory, which many of us may have taken. I have, when I had twisted my knee once. It's a really good drug because it's effective. It had just come off patent in the 90s, and so it was freely available, being widely produced throughout Asia and being used to treat livestock. And it was kind of a miracle drug because you could give it out. It treats fever as well as inflammation, and it was cheap, and it was accessible, and so it was suddenly flooding the market, and it was everywhere. After the publication of this research, the same relationship was confirmed in India and Nepal, and carcass surveys were carried out of dead cows basically throughout in wide areas of India. And by doing that, the researchers were able to find that the level of diclofenac in the carcasses was sufficient to actually be able to cause the decline that had occurred. So there was although we couldn't prove what had happened, it was certainly possible that that was what had happened. And that is now the accepted theory about what has caused the decline of vultures. 99.9% declines, 3 widespread species, and the cause was a drug that people were giving their cows. Now, as you know, probably cows are sacred in a lot of India, or they are sacred in India and Nepal, and people are very concerned with keeping them well, and there is a strong inclination to treat an animal if it's unwell. That animal is very valuable, as well as being important. And but unfortunately, because of poverty, people tend to treat the animal when it's quite close to death. So these animals were often dying with a high just after they'd been treated with the miracle drug. They'd kind of rally for a bit and then die because they were probably very unwell by the time they got any treatment. And so the carcasses were pretty loaded with the drug, and the vultures were feeding. And because the way they feed en masse, it only takes one carcass to kill quite a lot of birds. So, faced with this challenge, this kind of hitherto unknown challenge, what did everyone do? The RSPB got involved at about this point, actually. So the UK, we had an existing relationship with BNHS, the conservation group in India. BirdLife International were also involved, along with the Peregrine Fund and several other conservation groups, as well as the local governments and local organisations in India, Nepal, Bangladesh and Pakistan. And over a series of meetings through the early 2000s, set out a couple of clear goals. One was to remove diclofenac from the environment in Asia for veterinary use. And that involved identifying some safe alternatives, advocating for new legislation and implementing a ban on sale of the drug in use. And then the second thing that was seen as necessary was to establish a breeding program for 3 critically endangered species, because at that stage they were still in free fall, and it seemed pretty challenging to get some Asian governments to ban a drug which was so widely used and across several different countries for a bird which was not going to stop at a border. And what happened? Well, somewhat surprisingly, in 2006, India, Nepal and Pakistan all banned veterinary use of diclofenac, which was pretty impressive, actually, a big step. And in 2008, India followed that up with a labelling change for human diclofenac to say it wasn't for veterinary use, because people continued to use human diclofenac. And in 2015, they followed it up with another change, which was preventing the sale of large vials of human diclofenac, because cows require a higher dose than humans, and large vials were used for multi-doses of humans, but they were also being used to treat livestock. What I found really interesting when I was working on this program is that when I've had diclofenac, it's given as a pill, but in India there's a cultural preference for injections. Maybe not amongst, I don't know if that's completely widespread. Apparently it also applies to veterinary medicine, because an injection is seen as a proper medicine. So you're giving it's proper real medicine that you're giving straight away. And so it's injectable diclofenac for humans even, which in this country, if you suggested to my children certainly that they should have an injection rather than anything else, it would be a complete riot. So it's quite interesting. So they banned the large vials, and then that was challenged by some of the companies that were making them, and that was upheld by the court. There is still some evidence that some suppliers are packaging a number of small vials of diclofenac and selling it for vet use, but it's making it more difficult, and that's the government are supporting the ban. And at the same time as this kind of policy and lobbying work was going on, some of my other colleagues who had formerly been avian ecologists, including Richard Cuthbert, who did his PhD here in New Zealand on Hutton shearwaters, turned their minds to finding a safe alternative for a diclofenac. And again, drawing on experience from captive holders, they found that birds had been treated with a drug called meloxicam, which was also an anti-inflammatory, and that hadn't had the same negative effects as diclofenac. they were able to again use a partnership in South Africa to test that drug on captive birds, and they found that it did not have negative effects. So we knew there was one safe alternative at least in the market, and we could start to say that this is a safe thing that you can use. It will still make your cows better. There are a few challenges with that, but there always are some challenges. So that was quite a big win, I think, all of that on that side. And so then the next thing was thinking about how can we actually make the environment safe? And what happened was we got some resources from the UK and brought those out to Asia to establish provisional vulture safe zones, and to start to look at vulture safe zones. So the idea of a vulture safe zone is that it's 100 kilometres radius drawn out around a surviving population of vultures into their breeding colony. That makes 30,000 kilometres squared for each site. And each site has a staff team, and they go out and do carcass surveys within that area. They do pharmacy surveys to see what's being sold. They talk to the community about using the safe alternatives. And sometimes, more recently, they've been able to also satellite track wild birds to see how their survival is going, or satellite track in the later years released birds. So this has been quite a successful initiative and focus and effort. We just could not make the whole of India safe. That's the ultimate goal, but in reality, with such focus effort, similar work is now happening actually in Africa, where vultures are now also begun to decline really dramatically due to different reasons. But yeah, we're able to share experience, which is great. So while all the work was going on in situ, we also started the ex situ breeding program. And for this, we drew on experience from around the world, including people who'd been involved with California condor and Eurasian griffon vultures. The lady on the top right is Jemima Parry-Jones, who was involved with the International Centre for Birds of Prey in Newark, who pioneered a lot of the incubation techniques that we used. And I don't think Vivi's in the picture, but Dr. Vivi Prakash was the team leader in India who kind of managed all the centres. But yeah, involved a lot of different people. And again, it was actually pretty successful, given that most of these species hadn't been widely kept in captivity. I think 2 of them had never been bred in captivity before. The centres were able to fledge their first chick in 2008. It all started in 2006. They had 3 species bred, and all 3 species had bred by 2010, and now in 2022, over 750 birds have been produced in that program. And it involved taking wild nestlings into captivity and rearing them until they were old enough to breed, and then doing the breeding and artificial incubation, returning eggs. So it's intensive management, successful in terms of production, but there were a lot of challenges, including the legendary bureaucracy of Asia, various political issues, international security. So satellite tags couldn't be imported to India for a long time because they were felt to be a kind of military security issue. The religious challenges around not being able to feed cows to the birds in captivity meant that we had to source goats, and there was a constant challenge to source enough goats, and where they came from and who they came from. And yeah, so I think Vivi spent a lot of his time as a goat purchaser, and just getting secure funding for these breeding centres is really difficult. Keeping birds in cages costs a lot of money, and then there were just the kind of local challenges. Like once a nest of Africanized honeybees set up in one of the aviaries and stung some birds to death. Another time, there are cobras at the Pinjore site, which is one of the main breeding centres. Vivi just told me that he knows where they are and he just kind of avoids them. But the worst incident while I was working there was the Nepal Centre is co-housed with other government conservation work, and they had a holding pen for tigers that were problematic. So tigers that had attacked people, and one of the tigers got out of the holding pen and killed one of our vulture centre workers. So it just makes you think how lucky we are to be in New Zealand, where, you know, our challenges are many, but they are not getting eaten by a tiger, and I'm very thankful for that. And just the work that people put their heart and soul into this, and it was really remarkable to see how it worked. The breeding centres, Pinjore in Haryana, so in North India, that was the main centre, and that's still the main centre. And then under the SAVE program, or the RSPB was supporting the 4 that are coloured in green. The ones in sort of light orange are now, because so many birds have been produced, they're now being held in these other centres, which are run by the Indian Central Zoo Authority. There are also 2 centres, breeding centres in Nepal and Pakistan, 1 in each. And none of this would have been possible without a huge amount of organisations and people. And one of the real things I loved the most about working on this program was the partnership, and it was a really amazing supportive partnership across a lot of Asian countries where politics could have been a challenge, but they weren't allowed to be a challenge. And there was just great cooperation from everybody, a lot of fantastic experts, and I thought it was a really exemplary way to do conservation in extremely challenging circumstances, but it realised a lot of benefits. So when the Nepalese started doing releases in 2017, some of the birds flew into India, and the Indian teams were able to go and check on them and see if they were okay. It was really great, and I think if we could all do conservation like this, would be we'd have a lot more success. Every year, the team, the wide team, would try and get together for a meeting, and they would usually try and organise it in a place where they could do some intensive lobbying of the local government and try and get them to make some commitments which they could later hold them to. And every year we updated the SAVE blueprint, which is like a recovery plan, a meta recovery plan with lots of actions for different people. But what actually was really great about it is that it was updated every year, and it was used, and people got held to account for what they did. So it wasn't a recovery plan that just sat on shelf, written and then passed over to history. It was a living document that was really used, and people, actually looked at it. So I thought that was also brilliant, and we could all learn a lot about things from doing that. Of course, even as we were having some success in some areas, we started to know about even more threats to vultures, particularly power infrastructure and poison baits. And these are some of the same threats that are occurring in Africa. However, in Asia, there wasn't still the threat of NSAIDs. Vulture populations would still be a lot better off. So this has all been a bit depressing about all the problems, but this is actually a story about hope in the end, because when at my last SAVE meeting before I left the UK, which was held in Nepal, our science team presented this rather dramatic graph, which is really some red and blue dots. But the important thing is that it's looking a bit like a smile, and that's because it's going up. It's gone down and it's going up again. And these were the results of road transect surveys in Nepal. Nepal never had such a range of NSAIDs available as India. It made diclofenac illegal in 2006, and it has not. The market for some of the other NSAIDs that are present in India has never really kicked off in Nepal. So they've actually got quite good uptake of meloxicam, which is the safe alternative. And the trends in vulture numbers seem to have actually responded to the ban, and they started to improve, which is fantastic. And it gave the program so much confidence that we released birds from captivity in Nepal in 2017. The first releases were captive reared birds. They were birds that had been taken in as chicks, and they all survived. One did get eaten by a leopard, but the others seemed to do quite well. So, and the behavior, it was really interesting observing their behaviour. They clustered around the feeding area. We tried to move the feeding area so they wouldn't just sit there and eat, because for a while, for any bird, it's like, well, if you could feed me, I'm just going to stay here and eat. But they've actually adjusted to life in the wild pretty well since then, and the further releases have done really well. And these formerly captive birds first attempted to breed in 2020. They first succeeded in breeding in 2021, and in 2022, this year, one of the captive release birds bred at a colony that wasn't even known about until this bird was tracked and it was discovered. So it's 160 kilometres away from the release site. So So Nepal's been really brilliant, and I think that gives us a bit of hope for vultures overall. And in the last year, there's been other progress. The Bangladesh government has declared a ban on ketoprofen. So it's the first, so it's another NSA that's been shown to be toxic. It's the first country to do that. And safety testing work that's been ongoing in India has finally identified a second safe drug, which is great as well, gives people more alternatives. And the vulture safe zone, which was provisional in Nepal, is now being declared to be actually vulture safe. So the levels of NSAIDs in the wild and carcasses are so low that we think that vultures are safe in that area, which is fantastic. I mean, yeah, it's a big achievement by the teams in Nepal. There's still a lot of drugs out there that are not safe for vultures, and yeah, so diclofenac at bottom is banned in virtually everywhere. Ketoprofen is only banned in Bangladesh, and then aceclofenac and mesiolide, known to be highly toxic, are completely legally available. Flunixin and carprofen is toxic, and then the top two are safe. And then there's a bunch of others which haven't been tested. These drugs will continue to be popular because people need them for their livestock, and all we can really do is try and promote the safe ones and try and get governments to prohibit the banned ones. But it is politically difficult for governments in developing countries to stop people using things that preserve their livelihoods. So it's a continuing challenge. Some releases have started in India, despite still having quite worryingly high levels of NSAIDs in the wild, and the program is watching that with interest and some concern. However, I guess we all want optimism as well. So, so yeah, we'll watch this space. And at the end, have we saved Asia's vultures? Well, I think what we've done is given them a lifeline. There are some places in Asia now where vultures can be safe, and we know what we need to do to make them safe. There's still quite a long road to save them completely. Working in a country as populous as India, and as politically challenging, and a region as politically challenging and diverse as South Asia, there would always be challenges. But to me, if we can actually save this bird, which can travel hundreds of kilometers across national boundaries in the most densely populated part of the world, we should be able to save everything here. Like, this should be easy. I think this is a real story of hope and cooperation and collaboration. And if you're interested in learning more, there's a website, like there always is, savevultures.org. It's got all the latest news. They are likely to run an open day in January where they have kind of mini conference online, and then so those presentations are available and recorded. And there's an email list if you're really interested and want to get into it. If you ever visit Nepal and go to Chitwan National Park, I would highly recommend visiting the Vulture restaurant there, which is run by the local community. It's a great opportunity to contribute to that community's livelihood, and it's a real spectacle to see vultures feeding, several species of vultures feeding like they should be. And yeah, just doing their job. And that's the end. So if anyone's got any questions, we'll try and figure out how to do that. I can stop this.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was just fascinating, and just such an eye-opener to realise how easy it is, or simple, I suppose, it is here in comparison. You know, we're such an isolated island nation, relatively unpopulated, and people tend to follow science. So there's been a few exceptions to that lately. So I suppose we've got a few red flags as well. But yeah, just such an eye-opener to see how complicated conservation can be in other regimes, and yeah, just dealing with so many nations and so many different factors. You know, all the cultural influences coming into it. You know, which is something which, you know, I was really intrigued there with. You know, obviously the cattle, but just to get the ball rolling with questions while everyone else is thinking about it. What about the vultures themselves? You know, are they given any sort of status in these different communities, or?
No, so they so although they aren't persecuted, but they are considered to be unlucky. So or in some places, so in Nepal they are considered to be quite unlucky, and if one lands on your house, then it's meant to be a kind of messenger of bad luck. And but that's where the community teams have really been trying to work with local people to encourage them to change their minds, and the ecotourism aspect has been quite valuable in that, and giving them a bit of a value in the community and showing that people come to see them, value them. But yeah, they're certainly not afforded the same sacred status. And so interestingly in Nepal, they've kind of managed to, at the release site, they run a cow sanctuary adjacent to the vulture centre. So it's kind of a sanctuary for retired cows that are a bit old, and you can send them there and they live out their life in peace and harmony. And then when they eventually do pass away, then they're fed to the vultures as part of the circle of existence, which is quite a good,
It's really intriguing, because you said that with the captive vultures, feeding them cattle is a no-no. Apparently you can feed cattle to wild vultures.
Well, you can't kill them, so that you can't kill the cows. So if the cow dies naturally, and that's the problem when you've got captive vultures, you have to have a kind of continued food supply. But the other thing, Vipu, who ran the vulture breeding centres, he was very well connected, and every now and then he'd get a call that an elephant had been struck by a train. It was like Christmas for the vulture breeding centre, because they would benefit from that meat. And they could, so it was, he was very good at taking opportunities where he could. It was always very surprising what he'd been up to.
Right, you'd need a big truck. Oh, fascinating. Right, we'll throw the floor open, so we'll keep an eye on the screen if we see anyone unmute or put their hand up or anything. But in the meantime, the live audience, any questions for Clare?
Yeah. So Annemieke just asked if there was any thoughts about when the breeding program might be able to stop, because the idea is certainly that the vultures will eventually be released and it won't be necessary. And in Nepal, that's happening. So that's what I forgot to say. In 2023, so in March, the plan is to release the last. That was a very good cue. The last vultures from Nepal, so that will be finished. And that was really interesting, actually, because in 2018 we started talking about that with the Nepalese, and there was a little bit of resistance. I think they felt that being closed down was a punishment, and that a lot of us think if your conservation program's closed down, oh, that's we don't want it to close down because we quite like it. And so we had to talk to them a lot about how actually that was the aim, and that's a success, and then they could put those resources into other things. And yeah, so they've done so well, and they're closing in March. India has been more tricky, and they've got a lot more birds, and they haven't been able to use satellite tracking until really recently. So we've had very little way of knowing what would happen to those birds, and there was a big reluctance to just throw them out and without tracking. But they have done a few releases now with tracking, and I think pending how those go, the idea will be to slowly start to release birds, and over the next few years. But that satellite tracking was just such a barrier to being able to tell where they were, and they go such long distances that any other type of tracker is pretty difficult to use.
And I noticed looking at my screen that Annemieke is double dipping, that she's here in person and listening in virtually. So I wonder if the real Annemieke has any questions. Any other questions? Jeff?
What fill the ecological niche once talking about almost the vultures disappeared?
Yeah. So what's filled the ecological niche? So that's a really interesting question. And I think it's a combination of humans. So India and the other Asian countries have had to institute quite strict carcass disposal rules, which have meant they've got carcass dumps, which is where we go to do the NSA testing, but basically you're not allowed to leave carcasses lying around because there are just too many and they're not being cleaned up. But also feral dogs and jackals and other ground-based scavengers. And the feral dog problem, feral dogs increased by about 30%, and rabies actually increased quite significantly during the period of vulture decline. And that was it's been linked. I think it's always difficult to show cause and effect, but there was certainly a correlation that dog numbers increase and rabies attacks on humans increase. So yeah. Does rabies affect vultures? I don't think it does. I know they can catch TB, so they do carry a number of other diseases, but I don't think rabies affects them. Yeah.
And what about sort of raising awareness and support globally? Because vultures don't have a particularly high status, I suppose, among most Western nations either.
Yeah, condors do. I know. Condors are like a vulture with good PR, basically. Yeah, people do like griffins. Yeah. So I think there are a number of organisations doing vulture advocacy. But in Europe, in particular, there's the Vulture Conservation Foundation, and they do projects with European vultures, but they also do advocacy. And BirdLife International has a Love Vultures campaign. And there's an International Vulture Awareness Day. There's quite a lot of work happening in Africa now because of the decline in African vultures, and some of that is so they haven't had the same problem with UNICEF, but they have more problems with poison baits and also belief-based use. And so there's quite a lot of campaigning now to try and relieve some of that pressure on populations, and that's been partly driven by expansion of populations in West Africa with belief-based use of vultures has been going on for a long time, but because of increased globalization and everything else, now vultures being harvested in other parts of Africa for that use and taken to the places where they're used. So, so yeah, quite big campaigns in some parts of the world. Less probably in Australasia where there's less interaction with vultures. Yeah.
Right. Anyone in our virtual audience with questions?
Yeah, Claire, Rod here. But surprising, really, that all the species seem to be affected really equally. Are there not ecological differences between them that you might have expected to mean some were more susceptible than others?
Yeah, that is quite interesting, and I probably don't know enough about them to know that. I know that the three gyps vultures were all, very affected, and red-headed as well seems to have been affected. And I think because vultures, although they do have different ecological, they each kind of go to a different part of the carcass, but all of these old world vultures are quite similar. The new world vultures, actually, some of them are more resistant to the impacts, so they're not as bad. So I think the turkey vultures and the American vultures might not be so badly impacted by these drugs, but I'd have to double check that. But the gyps vultures or gyps vultures are all seem to be badly affected. And some of the eagles have been found to be they're also very susceptible. So yeah, something in their physiology is making them susceptible.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any further questions from either audience? Right, well, thank you, Claire. You're just fascinating, and thank you for making time to come along and present that and just open our eyes to some conservation scene so different to what we have here. So yeah, thank you very much. We'll leave the link open for a few more minutes just in case anyone's got any other comments before we log off. But I see a few clapping symbols here. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you have a great break over the summer, and we look forward to meeting again in person and virtually early February. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
Should I make you the host again, Stephen?
Look,
should I stop the recording?
Just stop the recording. I think that'll be fine. And when we all leave that